the Concepts from the Global South podcast. Here we explore the connections between the past and present of non-European societies with the help of antique, classical, modern, emic, and ethic concepts. My name is Alisa Shablovskaya, and I'm postdoctoral fellow in Iranian Studies at the University of Oslo. Today our guest is Oliver Scharbrodt, who is a professor in Islamic Studies at Lund University. Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Alisa. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Today we're going to talk about the concept of the guardianship of jurisconsult, or VELAYAT-E in Persian, but from a broader regional and global perspective. Oliver's research is mostly concerned with the intellectual history of Islam, and he has published numerous works, very interesting books on the intellectual history of Baha'ism, on Islam in Ireland, Islamic modernism, Muhammad Abduh, and have I forgotten any of your books?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
So, and now you're writing a book about Ayatollah Shirazi and the Shirazi dynasty. So, and also one about Talikani, so we're very excited about that.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, so back to the main topic of our conversation today. We're going to talk about the concept of velayat or wilaya, which is usually translated as authority or jurisdiction. But it also deals with such aspects of authority as charisma or supposed closeness to God. In the context of this wide semantic field, both in Arabic and Persian, how does the meaning of wilaya or velayat shift when applied in the phrase velayat-e faqih?
Yes, I mean, as you said, I mean, the concept of wilaya in Arabic and velayat in Persian sort of denotes authority, and it's the notion that because of your proximity to something or someone, like your proximity towards God, towards the proximity of an authority figure, you are entitled to exercise authority on their behalf. So when we talk about velayat-e faqih, the guardianship of the jurisconsult, it sort of describes, it encompasses the authority that jurisconsults, clerics in Shi'i Islam can exercise, because, I mean, we know in 12 Shi'ism, the actual spiritual, religious, political head and leader of the Muslim community is the Imam. And of course, 12 Shi'is believe in 12 Imams from the family of the Prophet. And 12 Shi'is believe that the 12th Imam is an occultation and will appear before the Day of Judgment as the Mahdi. So the question is, okay, who exercises authority while he is an occultation? Because you need religious leadership, you need religious guidance, you need political leadership, and who exercise this type of leadership? So velayat-e faqih, as a general term, not in the kind of political reading we come later to, as it had been understood by Khomeini and had been implemented as the kind of foundational ideology of the Islamic Republic, just denotes, the extent and the type of authority that clerics, a jurisconsult, an expert in Islamic law who has reached a particular level, the level of a mujtahid, the level to perform ijtihad, to engage in independent reasoning, to arrive at legal judgments, to issue fatwas, if you like. And, the question is, okay, there's an agreement. Yes, they are the ones who collectively, the clerics, collectively represent the Hidden Imam. They lead the Shia community in his absence. That sort of is described or entailed in this term velayat-e faqih. The debate obviously is, what is the scope? What is the extent of this authority? What functions of the Hidden Imam do jurisconsults assume? And there, of course, we have a broad range of different opinions.
Well, thank you so much. It was very informative. But now let's discuss the second part of this concept, the faqih part, or the jurist. So now we're talking about the Shi'i scholars. And in 12 Shi'i jurisprudence before Khomeini, there were different kinds of, different conception of responsibility of scholars towards society. So what were the different roles attributed to these jurists? And how did Khomeini's use of them depart from those traditions?
Yes. Again, I think the debate until today among Shi'i clerics is, what's the scope, what is the extent of velayat, the authority that clerics can exercise. Which of the various prerogatives, the various roles of the imam can they assume during his absence? And we might say, I mean, again, it's a bit simplified, that we have two broad trends within Shi'i jurisprudence, within Shi'i, amongst clerics of Islamic law in Shi'i context, two broad approaches. One approach arguing for a very limited guardianship, for a limited velayat, and another school that argues for a very expensive velayat. So the limited school would say, yes, of course, we exercise authority on behalf of the imam, but only in certain areas. Of course, it is in questions of ritual practice, how to pray, fasting, these sort of things. Yes, you refer to the faqih, to the expert on Islamic law. It is about other, questions of religious practice, like dietary laws, haram and halal. It is about what we might call personal status law, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and so on. So there is an agreement that this is something that is part of the remit of the faqih. And then it goes to other areas. The implementation of certain Islamic penalties. I mean, you have the Quranic hudud, the Quranic penalties for certain crimes like murder, theft, adultery. So again, there's an agreement, yes, because it's Quranic and they're the religious leaders, this is something that also the religious scholars implement. And then there's another aspect which in a sense moves outside, in a sense, of the purely ritualistic legal sphere, that there's an understanding that the faqih, the jurist consult, also has responsibility for what is called in Islamic jurisprudence umur hezbiyah. It's a bit difficult to translate. I mean, a literal translation would be the affairs of the marketplace. I mean, hizbah is market. And of course, in kind of pre-modern Muslim societies, the marketplace was the public space. This is where people of all sorts of backgrounds came together. The jurist consult has a responsibility to ensure that the public sphere, the marketplace, as the sort of epitome of the public sphere, adheres to Islamic conceptions of public morality. So in terms of dress and proper relations between different people and so on. So in that, of course, we can see already with this concept of al-umur al-hizbiyah, the faqih, even in a restricted sense, assumes a certain public and social role. It's not just concerned with marriage and rituals and so on. No, they have collectively a responsibility to ensure that the public arena adheres to Islamic morality. Now, Khomeini is part of another tradition which goes back at least to the early 19th century that would argue velayat faqih, the velayat, is complete and expensive. If we assume as Shi'is that the jurisconsults, the clerics, are the collective deputies of the hidden imam, they represent the hidden imam, this means they represent him in all aspects. Yes, religious questions, dietary questions, personal status law, public morality, but the imam is also the head of the Islamic community in a political sense, the political leader of the Islamic community. So this goes back to Ahmad Naraqi in the early 19th century would say, no, the velayat faqih is complete. There's no exception. Every aspect of the authority of the imam, all the prerogatives the faqih or the clerics can claim in total. And there was obviously a realization, okay, we are the religious consults, we cannot actually lead a country. We need in Iran, I mean, Ahmad Naraqi was in the Iranian context, Qajar period, early 19th century. Of course, it's the Shah who is the political leader, the secular ruler of the country. He never questioned this, but he would say, we bestow this authority to him. The Shah cannot be Shah without us as the collective representatives giving him the legitimacy, the mandate to exercise political leadership during the occultation of the imam. So we have Ahmad Naraqi, and again, it's contested. I mean, it's quite interesting. His student, Sheikh Murtaza Ansari, again, another very prominent 19th century cleric, was of completely different opinion. and he was more for a restricted understanding. He said, no, it's not a political authority. So even between teachers and students, you might have different views. So this has been contested. So there's a long tradition and a long debate among Shi'i clerics about the extent of authority. And Khomeini, obviously, and we can see this in his early writings from the 1940s when he made this, his first political interventions. If you look at his book Kashf al-Asrar, for example, which he wrote, I think, in 1943, 44. He is part, and even in the 1950s, his works, he is part of the school of thought in Islamic jurisprudence or in Shi'i jurisprudence that argues for the expansive authority of the faqih. But in his early writings, he never questions the legitimacy of the monarchy, the existence that you have a Shah. Again, they derive their authority from the ulama, and they have a responsibility, obviously, to implement Islam. But until the late 1960s, it didn't cross Khomeini's mind to translate this tradition of a very expensive, a very broad understanding of velayat into the aim that the clerics themselves should assume political power in a state. That is sort of the shift. So the line of thought has a long tradition, again, goes back at least 200 years, if not more, saying velayat is complete. But the idea, okay, we question the legitimacy of the secular rulers, and we as clerics ourselves have not only the right, but we have the obligation to assume political power and to lead the state. That is where Khomeini, in a sense, departs. So we might say from the tradition. So we might say with people like Ahmad Naraki and other figures with this kind of expansive understanding, it was more like a legal theory. It was, this is, the theoretical foundation of all authority. But what Khomeini did, and of course what happened after the revolution in Iran, is to implement this legal theory as the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic and to operationalize that in an Islamic state.
Okay, so now we know that it's a very long intellectual tradition, but still you put a lot of emphasis on the 19th century. So how would you connect this evolution, this more and more explicit affirmation of faqih's responsibility in the public and political sphere with the advent of modernity, or so-called modernity in Iran, such as the breakdown of the Safavid Empire, the birth of Iranian nation-state, and such a milestone as the Constitutional Revolution? What impact those events of those processes had on the formulation of this expansive understanding of guardianship?
I think the foundation for this more expansive understanding predates sort of the arrival of modernity in Iran or in the Middle East, and it's as you pointed out, a direct consequence of the fall of the Safavids, because suddenly the clerics who had been patronized by the Safavids as a Shi'i dynasty lost their state sponsor, their state patron, and they had to find other ways to sustain their scholarly activities, their teaching activities, their educational activities, and became, if we would like to say, in terms of the political economy, financially self-sufficient. There's the sense, if you're a senior cleric, you're entitled to receive religious taxes that Shi'is have to pay. Of course, we have zakat, we have khums, which is specific to Shia context. And as a lay Shi'i, you need to follow a particular senior cleric and pay your religious taxes to this particular person. So from the late 18th century, again, as a consequence of the fall of the Safavids, the clerics in the Shi'i context established a political economy that made them independent, autonomous from state patronage. And of course, once you are in this position that you don't really need financial support and financial patronage by the state, you can define your relationship towards the state in a very different way. So I think this more, if you like, self-confident attitude that Shi'i clerics assumed in Raja Iran in the 19th century is a result of the kind of financial autonomy they have gained. And of course, There is obviously an impact of modernity, an impact of colonialism, and we know that clerics were, very vocal in the opposition towards colonial encroachment, giving trade concessions to European countries and European traders and so on. I mean, most famous in 1892, I think, the Tobacco Revolt, when the Iranian Shah Nasruddin Shah gave a monopoly to the trade of tobacco to, I think, a British individual. And then there was, the most senior cleric, Mirza Shirazi, issued, fatwa declaring the consumption of tobacco haram. So there was a boycott as a sign of protest. So that, that sort of was the first sign where sort of clerics were able to flex their muscles and challenge decisions by the secular leaders, by the Shah, that contravened, the interests of their constituency, because, of course, we know in the Iranian context and also in other contexts, there's a close connection between the clerical class and the mercantile class, between the fuqaha and the bazaris, intermarriage and close family relations. And, of course, it has to do with the political economy as well. So the ulama in the Iranian context, also in other contexts, would always speak out against the rulers if the interests of their most immediate constituency, the bazaris, the traders, the merchants, were threatened. Now, I would argue, maybe it's a bit simplistic, that Iran only became a modern nation state properly, if I can say that, with the Pahlavis after 1925. I think the Rajas was still more kind of an imperial construct with indirect rule and so on. But of course, with the Pahlavis, we suddenly have a completely different game in town. We have, the attempt to turn Iran into a centralized modern nation state, centralizing authority in the government, and also modernizing, society, the economy, establishing modern infrastructure. And we have a state that whose ideological foundation is not Shia Islam. A state whose ideology is modeled on, secular iterations of Iranian nationalism. That was a new challenge. So you suddenly had a state that had the infrastructure, the possibility to take over and control all sectors of society, and a state whose leaders are not ideologically committed to Islam, to Shia Islam. I mean, previous rulers, the Rajas, Safavids, again, the individual rulers might not have cared about Islam or Shia Islam at all, but at least it was important for them to appear in the public arena as sponsors, as patrons of Shia Islam. That was not necessarily a priority. And of course, the Shia clerics saw, okay, the modern state is a very, very powerful construct that has the ability to shape and influence all sectors of life, and also encroaches on sectors that are traditionally our responsibility, like education, the legal system, judiciary, and of course, encroaching and trying to control the autonomy of the clerical sector. And I think, given the particular ideological political challenge that the modern state became for clerics in Iran, and we can see something very similar in the Iraqi context, with the rise of pan-Arabism against secular nationalism. So the state being different, and then there was a sense, okay, if the state becomes hostile to us and is not even interested to appear to be Islamic, then we as clerics need to take over the state. So yeah, I think the foundations for, if you like, the more self-confident attitude go back, I think, to the late 18th century, with the sort of a new political economy. And then, yeah, with the arrival of modernity in Iran, in the Middle East, the rise of the modern state, the modern nation state, there was a different ideological political challenge. And for people like Khomeini, it required a different response, different rules of engagement that had, ideological, jurisprudential foundations within the tradition, but equally departed significantly from it.
Well, it's ironic because the main thing which I learned from your work is that when we think about Iranian concepts, we should look beyond Iran and
Absolutely,
we should
yeah.
look beyond the Pahlavi state. So, in your article, you emphasize the Iraqi clerical milieu, especially the Shirazi network, as crucial for Khomeini's formulation. Could you elaborate on how these networks shaped the idea?
Yeah, I mean, usually particular kind of in post-revolution historiography in Iran itself, and I think in a lot of scholarship as well, there's a lot of emphasis on Khomeini as having pioneered in developing this concept that in a truly Islamic state, if we believe that the faqih is the representative of the imam, the head of this Islamic state needs to be a faqih, needs to be a jurisconsult. But I think it's important to recognize that he was not the first one to put this idea forward, that there was, a broader intellectual milieu emerging within politically activist, politically mobilized Shi'i clerics in Iran and Iraq that began to articulate these ideas. I mean, in the Iranian context, one might refer to other examples. Again, this example has to be taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt, but I mean, in his memoirs, Ayatollah Montazeri, he talks about conversations he had with his friend and I think roommate in the seminaries in Qom, Morteza Motahari. And this was, I mean, according to him, happening in the late 50s, where they were thinking, who should actually rule an Islamic state? And they felt, well, if we take the absolute velayat, seriously, it means that, the state needs to be ruled by a faqih, by a jurisconsult. And they went to Khomeini, who was the teacher, and of course Ayatollah Montazeri was the favorite student of Khomeini, and said, what do you think? We just discussed this. We think, an Islamic state should be ruled by a faqih. Isn't that the logical conclusion? And Khomeini apparently said, no, this is utter nonsense. We as Shi'is, we wait for the arrival of the Imam, for the coming of the Imam, and, the idea that we as fuqaha, we as jurisconsults assume political authority doesn't make any sense. Again, this is what Montazeri writes in the early 2000s, reflecting on it and so on. So, but it's interesting. I mean, even if we have to take this as a pinch of salt, there were discussions in Iran. And then there is this very influential, bit understudied contribution that was produced by various Islamist actors and clerical activists in Iran, I think 2 years after the death of Ayatollah Borujerdi. This collection, this edited volume, I think it's called Bahsida Darbareye Rohaniyat va Marjayat. So it's a study of, the role of clerics in the modern state. And there is an interesting contribution by Allama Tabatabai, who was obviously also a teacher of Khomeini and other important figures in the Islamic Revolution, who sort of also experiments, what does actually velayat mean in a modern state? Does it mean velayat is with the people, so the people exercise authority? Is it with the just Muslims, only the good Muslims that exercise authority? Or is it with the just faqih, the just, the righteous jurisconsult? He doesn't give an answer. It's more kind of a question. He just raised these questions. So we can assume in the Iranian context, there were people experimenting with these ideas beforehand. And yes, we also need to look at the Iraqi context where there was a strong school and a strong presence in the seminaries in Iraq, subscribing to this kind of absolute understanding, this expansive understanding of velayat faqih, and the Shirazis, a clerical family coming from Karbala, becoming politically very active, were among the first activists, sort of when they began their political activism in the late 1950s, early 1960s, who put forward this idea in their writings that any political activism in an Islamic context or in a Shia Islamic context is only legitimate if it's led by a cleric, and it also means that a state can only claim to be Islamic if it's led by a cleric. So yes, they were among the earliest groups in the Iraqi context who created a kind of intellectual space to discuss these ideas. And there were other figures. I mean, there is a Saudi scholar who studied in Najaf, Abdel Hadi al-Fadli, who was involved in the foundation of the other major Shi'i Islamist party organization in Iraq, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he has written a book, again, in the early 1960s, Fi Intizar al-Imam, so Waiting for the Imam, where he also quite explicitly says that, from the perspective of Shia jurisprudence, an Islamic State needs to be led by a jurisconsult. So there was these debates were clearly happening before Khomeini discussed it, and sometimes these debates were much more explicit in terms of demanding that a cleric needs to be the head of an Islamic State than Khomeini's lectures, because Khomeini, he mentions this, but he's also a bit vague and imprecise. And of course, we must not forget that from 1964 until 1978, so for 14, 13 years, Khomeini was exiled in Iraq. He was based in Najaf for most of the time, but he also traveled regularly to Karbala. He entertained very, very good, very close relations with the Shirazi clerical family. And we can assume that he, who already believed, in terms of his own jurisprudential background, in the absolute velayat, the most expensive authority, encountered these ideas and incorporated this. I mean, I'm always a bit careful with identifying trajectories of intellectual influence and so on. But I think, what I want to point out that Khomeini was not the first and the only clerical activist in this period who put forward this idea. There were other actors in Iran who were thinking about this, and in the most explicit form, I have come across this in the Iraqi context, and particularly in the writings of the Shirazi clerical family.
So as long as we talk about these extended geographies, how far did this dialogue between the Sunni and the Shi'i political thinkers go? Was there any influence of such organizations as the Muslim Brotherhood or such legendary thinkers as Said Qutb, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. That is clearly the case. Of course, when we talk about patterns of mobilization, that was clearly influenced by Sunni Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, and another movement is in the Iraqi context, Hizb ut-Tahrir. And we know that many activists that would later become prominent in Iraq, in Hizb ut-Tahrir, that initially were very active in the Iraqi branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and also in the Iraqi branch of Hizb ut-Tahrir. So again, even in terms of creating an organizational platform to mobilize politically, there's clearly an influence of Sunni Islamist organizations. And yes, there was an engagement with Sunni Islamist ideas, in particular, again, what is an Islamic State? What is the nature of an Islamic State? And of course, when we talk about Said Qutb, very important is the idea of Hakimiyya, divine sovereignty, and that an Islamic State as a political entity needs to embody, needs to translate, needs to implement Hakimiyya, the idea that God is the ultimate sovereign, in the way how society and politics is defined and works. And I think what happened in the Iraqi context, and then also through the translation of Said Qutb's work, is that these ideas were then incorporated by Shi'i figures, and then also think, okay, what does it mean in a Shi'i context? How do we implement Hakimiyya in an Islamic State whose ideological foundation is informed by Shi'i jurisprudential theories? And, the Shirazis, other figures, and of course Khomeini later on would say, Hakimiyya is only implemented if a faqih, if we say, the idea is to implement Islamic law. Who is the best person to implement Islamic law? It's the jurisconsult, it's the legal scholar. So the legal scholar needs to be head of an Islamic State. So there is, certain engagement. And of course, we should also emphasize that the idea of Hakimiyya, which had been popularized in the Arab world through Said Qutb, goes back to South Asian thinker, Abu al Maududi. So even to expand the geographical remit much further, I mean, he was the first one in the 1920s, 1930s, in the context of South Asia, who put forward this idea that an Islamic state needs to implement Hakimiyya, divine sovereignty, needs to be based on Islamic law. And then Said Qutb picked this up and then popularized this in the Arab-speaking world, and it's sort of also impacted, obviously, Shi'i Islamists both in Iraq and in Iran. So yes, absolutely. I mean, this is not always acknowledged, these influences. Again, when we look at key figures of the Shirazi network, for example, I mean, in the 1960s, 1970s, a key ideologue of the Shirazi movement was a scholar, Sayyid Taqi al-Mudarrisi, who was the nephew of the Shirazi brothers, who sort of led the network. And in his writings from the late 1960s onwards, I mean, he wrote a book called Al-Qiyada al-Islamiyya, Islamic Leadership, which is very much putting forward the idea that the faqih needs to be the head of an Islamic state. And he's more open, acknowledging the influence of Sayyid Qutb, incorporating the idea of Hakimiyya. And we also know that, within the study circles that the Shirazi network developed, they were actively engaging with the works of Ali Shariati, Sayyid Qutb, Maududi, all these figures. So there's, was a deliberate engagement with these figures and an attempt to, okay, how do we implement this? How do we translate this in the Shia context?
Well, it seems to me that non-Islamic political currents also played a huge role in how the scholars figured out their new Shi'i identity. And I find particularly interesting your mention of this dialogue between Mutahari and Mu'tazili from the 1950s, 1960s, because in my research, I came across of numerous mentions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's theory of lawgiver or législateur, which is basically the idea of faqih,
Yes.
the need for someone to educate Ummah before Ummah will be given democratic freedoms.
Yes.
So how would you evaluate the impact of non-Islamic European or just global political models and intellectual currents in shaping the idea of velayat-e in Iran?
Yes, I mean, I think absolutely. I think the nitty-gritty influences and similarities, I think, particular with kind of European traditions of political philosophy like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I think that needs to be unpacked more. I think, I mean, it's a methodological issue, perhaps in Islamic studies, in Iranian studies, that we sort of look for influences and patterns within the Islamic tradition or within even the Shi'i tradition and so on, and even within a particular national context. We're not necessarily that open to these global perspectives, but I think that is something that we can certainly observe, but it needs more unpacking and it needs to, further work. As I said earlier on, I mean, the state as it emerged, the modern state, posed a new ideological and political challenge, and it required a different kind of response. I mean, the most obvious, similarities and convergences we can see in the sense of a revolution, a popular uprising. This is obviously very much a Marxist influence, and result of the spread of leftist and communist Marxist forms of political activism and trying to bring them back. Young Iranians, young Iraqis who were attracted to leftist ideologies, to bring them back to the Shia fold by incorporating some of the kind of ideological repertoire, but also, kind of the sort of the nativism of Pan-Arabism. I mean, Pan-Arabism, which many Iraqi clerics rejected later on, is an anti-imperialist ideology and emphasizes sort of Arab nativism. And of course, if you look at Islamism, there's also a very strong nativist element. It's to be self-sufficient, to not to be economically, politically, cultural dependent on the West, to articulate, a kind of an authentic, in inverted commas, a genuine, indigenous identity. Yes, I think there is certainly this influence, through these very secular ideologies, but I think, a stronger grounding to identify intellectual trajectories and convergences with, broader traditions of political philosophy in the European and North American context, like connections to ideas of Rousseau, for example. I think that requires more research, and I think here your work will be extremely beneficial to identify these convergences and these trajectories.
It is ironic because now researchers talk a lot about Islamic influences on Rousseau, and that actually he had in mind the Muslim world while he was developing this idea. Yeah, so the idea traveled from the Middle East to France and back to the Middle East 300 years, well, 200 years after. But let's take a distance from this purely intellectual history of circulations and mutual influences and talk more about the actual political context and questions of contingency. So how much was the development of the concept of the guardianship of the jurisconsult a product of contingency and real politics, such as Khomeini's exile, the Ba'athist rise in Iraq, and the Pahlavi state's repression, and last and not least, the rise of communism?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm always a bit hesitant to disconnect theological reflections from the political context. I mean, I don't think there are pure theological reflections, and then there's a political context, and the political context is always pragmatic. And the engagement with intellectual traditions, theological traditions, is then very ideological and very static. I think both influence and shape one another. Um, and, theological reflections are also dynamic and respond to political developments, social developments, and so on. So, I think we need to look at both of them together and say, okay, this was just a pragmatic decision, or this was a purely theological decision. I mean, and as I said earlier on, this idea that the FAQIH, the jurisconsult, is the actual leader of the Islamic community because he represents the hidden imam in all aspects. This, as a tradition within certain schools of Islamic jurisprudence, is not necessarily, one should also mention, the majority view of Shi'i clerics. I think the majority of Shi'i clerics in the contemporary world would, be more on the side of a restricted understanding. Again, not a secular, not a purely religious. Yes, the FAQIH has a public role. He's responsible for ensuring that Muslim societies adhere to Islamic norms of public morality, but not necessarily becoming, the leader of a state or of assuming office in the state. So that's really, I mean, one should say this expansive view has always been, a minority view, and only became so prominent because it was established in the Islamic Republic after the revolution. So, so again, I think we need to look at both together. Recognize also that this is a bit of a minority view, um, and yes, as I said earlier, we need to see, taking this, absolute understanding of velāyat-e to a new dimension by saying an Islamic state needs to be led by a jurisconsult is a response to the actual ideological and political challenge the state posed, which was unprecedented and required a different perspective, different rules of engagement. I suppose we might say where pragmatic considerations come into play is then within the Islamic Republic, and okay, we have the system implemented. How can we ensure its survival? And I think there was a realization, in the years before Khomeini died, that you know it, we need to be a bit more flexible here, in the sense, okay, we want to have a jurisconsult as ruler, as leader of the country, but we can't expect him to be of the highest level of clerical authority, to be, what is called a marja taqlid, a source of emulation, so the highest level of clerical authority, the highest level in the clerical hierarchy in Shi'i Islam, which was initially a requirement to become leader. I mean, they realized, no, I mean, yes, he needs to be jurisprudent, he needs to have some clerical training, he needs to be a reasonably senior cleric, but of course, as political leader, he needs to be politically very astute. And, a senior cleric lives in the seminaries, studies jurisprudence, is also meant to be a bit detached from the world. So there was a realization we need to be flexible. And then, the constitution was amended in 1988, sort of shortly before Khomeini's death, and the requirement that the leader needs to be the most senior cleric, was abolished. So then later on, in terms of how in the implementation of this concept, the velāyat-e in the Islamic Republic, certain compromises were made, realizing that we can't get a senior cleric who is committed to the ideals of the Islamic Revolution, who believes in Khomeini's understanding of velāyat-e, and at the same time is also politically well-versed and astute to be the leader of a country. So later on we see adjustments made to how the principle is operationalized, implemented on pragmatic grounds.
It is also important to remember that there were alternative takes on this very expansive role of the jurists in the society. The Shirazis, the dynasty you study, and other clerics advocated for collective leadership through shura al-fuqaha. So not just one faqih, but many of them. Could you explain how this model differed from Khomeini's singular faqih and why it failed to dominate?
If we look at the constitution of the Islamic Republic of 79, it provides the option to have a leadership council. So this is another thing that was changed in 1988. Khomeini, at least in principle, was not opposed to this idea if we have 3 or 4 senior clerics in Iran who are equally qualified to rule as a collective the Islamic Republic. So this provision was there. And of course, Khomeini emerged as sort of the leader of the Islamic Revolution and, managed to sideline potential rivals, potential competitors, and so on for leadership. So it just sort of coalesced around him as a person after the Islamic Revolution. But the original provisions of the Constitution of 79 allowed for the possibility of a leadership council. So there is, in the original conception of the Iranian constitution after the revolution, a recognition that it could be a council of senior clerics running the country, because, again, from the perspective of Shi'i jurisprudence, the deputyship of the jurisconsult, of the imams, their representation is collective. It's not just one cleric who represents the imam, but there's a sense that collectively, as a community of scholars, they represent the imam. And this kind of idea, then translated in political sphere, was also then in the early version of the constitution, where there could be a council. But again, this was then another pragmatic adjustment. They had to, we need to lower the qualifications, the requirements to become a leader. It's unrealistic to expect him to be a senior cleric. And there was also a sense, a leadership council, that could potentially be messy. So it's better to have one figure as the supreme leader. It worked with Khomeini, and we do it the same with Khamenei and so on. So in the sense, the kind of the authors of the first constitution were not that far away from the Shirazis and their kind of collective understanding of clerical leadership in an Islamic state. The provisions were there in the original constitution, but they were later dropped. Now the Shirazis have been using this concept to demarcate themselves from the prevailing ideology in the Islamic Republic by saying, in Iran we have velayat-e or velayat-al-faqih, a singular faqih running the country, and this is autocratic, it's concentration of power, and we see what's happening and what it leads to. We support, because we believe in the collective deputyship of the clerics, of the hidden imam, that they do it as collective. We believe in a more consultative element. But, in the 70s and 60s, yes, these different camps were ideological much closer. And again, this notion of a singular faqih being the supreme leader of Iran was really only implemented, again, for pragmatic reasons, seeing this as politically more workable, in the late 1980s, and then implemented with the amendments to the Constitution in 1988 to make it more workable and more pragmatic and more practical.
The example of the Shirazis you just cited is very revealing about the nature of the debates which took place after the revolution inside the Shi'i political community and political milieu. But from a more general, broader perspective, how did internal Shi'i debates evolve once the Islamic Republic was established?
Yes, I mean, there was a lot of debate because, of course, the Shirazis were a particular voice and had a particular agenda and positioned themselves in a particular way. Um, but there were also other very, very prominent clerical figures, figures very close to Khomeini, strong supporters of the Islamic Revolution and of Khomeini's leadership of the Islamic Revolution, who, began to revise, to rethink how we need to conceptualize VELAYAT-E because they felt that, this kind of absolute reading, this, complete claim to represent the hidden Imam, has the danger, and it's not an unfounded danger, of turning into autocracy. So we need to rethink this. So we have figures like Ayatollah Montazeri, who was obviously, he was one of the favorite, the favorite student of Khomeini, and was meant to be Khomeini's successor as supreme leader, who held on to the concept, but felt it needs to be kind of democratized. And that the ruling jurisconsult, the supreme leader, needs to derive his mandate through popular approval. He needs to be elected, and not just once for the rest of his life, but he needs to be elected regularly. He needs to be accountable. So elections as a process. So there's a growing voice represented by figures like Ayatollah Montazeri, other reformist figures like Ayatollah Sanai, who would say, yes, of course. The qualifications to be supreme leader is, the jurisprudential training. He needs to be a relatively senior cleric. And, this derives from the fact that the clerics are the leaders of the Islamic community and so on. But the ruling cleric also needs to be democratically elected. There needs to be an element of democratic accountability. So these figures held on to the concept, but sought to democratize it. But then, we have other figures, if you like, senior clerics that are more loyal to the regime, like Mesbah Yazdi or Makarim Shirazi, who's not related to the Shirazi family, who would argue, no, the ruling faqih, the ruling jurisconsult, does not need to derive his legitimacy from the people. If the people agree with him and they are sort of personally and ideologically invested in the Islamic Republic, this is obviously better because then they're loyal and they work for it, and the system works better, the state works better. But ultimately, his legitimacy, his authority is not derived from the people. The authority comes from the Imam. And if it comes from the Imam, it comes from God. It's a divine designation, and a divine designation doesn't need popular approval because it comes from God. So, within, if you like, the camp of clerics in Iran today that were very vocal, very active during the Islamic Revolution, see themselves as successors of Khomeini, as the students. Yes, we have the reformist clerics who say we need to democratize. We stick to it, but we need to democratize it. It needs to be accountability and popular approval through elections. And there's the other camp that says, no, it's nice if people are invested in the regime, but this is a divine designation, completely independent of popular approval. One should also say that the majority of clerics in the clerical establishment of Qom don't even care about these questions. So, the kind of the politicized clerics, whether they are reformists or were reformists, or whether they were loyal to Khamenei and the way he has sort of embodied and implemented VELAYAT-E, there are minorities in the clerical establishment in Qom, in the seminaries in Qom. And of course, when we look at the wider Shia world, when we look at Najaf in Iraq, this becomes even more obvious. The majority don't even deal with these questions because they feel these kind of political fields, exercising political authority, becoming a leader of a country, what is the extent of the leadership, should they be elected? This is not something that traditionally clerics would engage with. So there is, a very, very strong, what we might call traditionalist camp, within the clerical establishment, I mean, it's diminishing because the regime is taking more control of the seminary institutions in Qom. But it's very, very strong in Najaf, where, yeah, of course, we advise, we voice our opinions on issues of public relevance because we have a public mandate, but we don't assume political power. I mean, if we look at, the most widely cleric in the contemporary Shia world is Ayatollah Sistani, the leader of the clerical establishment in Najaf. Again, I think we can't say he's apolitical. I mean, he has intervened on political questions in Iraq after the US invasion, in the fight against ISIS. He has also worked to dismiss certain prime ministers. So he has not been apolitical, but he's very clear that a cleric does not assume political power. I mean, the clerics that are affiliated to his network are not allowed to become members of political parties, are not allowed to become members of parliament, are not allowed to hold government offices. Students who want to study in his seminaries, they need to sign a declaration that they will never become politically active. And that is, I would argue, the mainstream, certainly in the Iraqi context, and I think still also in the Iranian context, although the space to articulate this very traditionalist view in the Iranian context becomes more difficult. I mean, at least to articulate this in the public.
Well, thank you, Oliver. We're running out of time, so I'll just ask my last question.
Sure.
Looking at Iran today, do you see the discourse around the guardianship of the Jurist Council shifting, whether towards reform, reinterpretation, or even obsolescence? Well, here I'm talking not just about the clerical milieu, but about the society in general. Where are we going with Velayat-e FAQIH?
I mean, I think we are probably, if I can put it that simply, not going anywhere. Because I don't think, and again, this is a bit controversial to say, I don't think that there is really a real alternative to the Islamic Republic at this stage. I mean, it's true that maybe only 10, 20% of the Iranian population are really invested, committed to this concept. And then you have a huge number of Iranian Shi'is who would consider themselves to religious and practicing Shi'i Muslims, maybe another 30% who are not really believing in the concept as such. I mean, they're practicing Shi'i Muslims, but they're not invested or subscribing to it. And then, of course, you have the significant segment of the Iranian population. Again, difficult to quantify. Maybe half of it, maybe more than that. That is secular and so on. So I think on the popular level, yes, it's a small minority. 10% of the population, maybe 20%. Again, difficult to quantify. That is really following the concept. But I think that's enough for a regime. I mean, if you have the support of 10 and 20% of the population, that's how you can manage. I think if we talk about more recent events, I mean, the recent war in the summer, a few months ago, between Israel and Iran, the so-called 12 Days War, I think that actually has given the current leadership in Iran an opportunity to strengthen their legitimacy. So, I mean, the grievances are still there. And of course, we see these protests on a regular basis because the grievances are still there. But I think even Iranians who are not ideologically committed to Velayat-e FAQIH felt a sense of national solidarity. The Iranian middle class, which is, again, for the most part, not ideologically committed to the regime, felt a sense of our nation. We as Iranians are under attack, whatever we think about the leadership. So I think, and of course, the leadership has been responding, not just since the summer, for the couple of years, by engaging more with national identity, sort of nationalizing Shi'i Islam and combining Iranian nationalism with, Shi'i Islam in stronger terms. engaging more and celebrating more the pre-Islamic heritage of Iran, which usually used to be a domain of sort of secular nationalists in the Iranian context. So I think, there is, I think for the current leadership, in particular for, the reformers, they see that as opportunity. Okay, we were under attack. Many people, despite the grievances, felt a sense of identification with Iran. We need to reach out to them. We need to take their grievances seriously. We need to broaden, if you like, our ideological discourse to appeal to Iranian nationalism, the pre-Islamic Iranian history and heritage, and so on. So, yes, the ideological commitment to the system on the popular level is very limited. But I think at the moment, there is no real ideological alternative. I can't really see it. The only alternative that is there is a kind of a reform from within. Of course, the reformists have been politically marginalized, exiled, and so on. They're very quiet and so on. They have retreated, but that's sort of the only real alternative I can see in the Iranian context, an attempt to democratize it and so on. Whether this is really going to happen, I don't know. But I can't really see an alternative to the current system, because when we look at what happened in Iraq after 2003, when we look at what happened in various Arab countries after the Arab Spring, when we look at what's happened to Syria since the fall of Assad, regime change is messy, it's brutal, it's chaotic. And I think even Iranians, again, who are not very committed to VELAYAT-E, they might prefer to stick to the system than to experiment with regime change where you don't know where it will lead to.
Well, thank you again, Oliver, for sharing your insights with us today. It was a great conversation as usual, and please find the references to relevant literature in the description of this episode, and stay tuned.